So I'll be talking about dynamics of low salinity groundwater lenses, particularly those of the South Australian River Murray floodplain, although I will venture across the border at one point. And this is work that's been done in collaboration with a few institutions. So I'm going to start by asking you all for a couple of minutes at least to imagine that you are a tree. In particular, that you are a tree in the South Australian Riverland. And depending on what species you are, you'll have particular needs in terms of how much access to fresh water that you need. Too much, and you will drown. Your roots will drown. Just enough, if you're a red gum, and you get plenty of access to fresh water. Or if there's less access to fresh water, then maybe you could survive as a black box trees, which are less fussy. However, if we have a look at the landscape through there, and this is just straight off Google Maps, you can see that it's kind of brown. These are quite challenging natural conditions for most species of tree. The mallee, of course, thrive. But for other species, you probably want to be closer to a freshwater source, such as a river, as you can see here. But yes, low rainfall. And the other major source which trees often tap into is the groundwater. But through here, through natural processes, the groundwater is often half to twice the salinity of the sea. And most species of tree are just going to give up at that point. It's also another thing that makes this landscape challenging is that it's a land of drought and flood conditions. It's a very dynamic landscape. Oops, that button again. Even I haven't been warned twice. And they have also been made even more challenging than those natural conditions through human intervention. So for one thing, we're extracting vast quantities of water from the River Murray, and that means that we are getting less flow into the system, and we're also getting fewer floods and smaller floods when they occur. At the same time, in these areas where we've got the salty groundwater, we have irrigation that increases the drainage, that raises the local water table, and that pushes more of that saline groundwater into the floodplain and the river. So we've got a bit of a double whammy here, in that we've got less fresh water from the river, but we've got more salt water coming into the system. And that's going to make life even harder for you as a tree. So sources of fresh water: rainfall, low, meh. River, limited extent, quite hard to get in there. Floods, infrequent and getting less frequent and smaller. And the groundwater, not good. Mostly it's saline. But there are some areas where you do get these little pockets of fresh water. So this, for example, is a cross-section through near Bukpanong and Loxton. And if we look at the geophysics conducted by CSIRO through here, long story short, if it's blue, it's fresher, probably. So we've got these pockets here, and obviously some of those coincide with the river channel, but other ones can stretch further away, and there might be another water supply for you as a thirsty tree. So, having pretended to be for a tree, I'll now snap back to a human point of view, to that of the land manager. Our exhibit here is the wonderful Jan Whittle, who works up on Chowla. So how can we, as tree shepherds or land managers, manage the system, a complex landscape, in a way where we can maintain these lenses, despite the complexities and the dynamism of the situation? So some of our questions from that point of view about why we care about these lenses would be, well, where is this fresh water from? How often is it recharged? And if we change how we manage the river, which we're doing a great deal because of things like environmental watering and continued irrigation, will we shrink or grow these lenses? So this figure just shows some of the possibilities about where the fresh water can come through. It can come just straight through the riverbed. It could come diffuse through the clay layer on the top of the floodplain. Or maybe there's cracks in the clay or sandy bits maybe the water gushes through those through a preferential flow. And how we might manage the system will depend on which of these mechanisms predominates. So to try and investigate this, a group of us set up an Australian Research Council linkage project. I'm not going to recite the number. Dynamics and Management of Riverine Freshwater Lenses, which had experts from Flinders University, Monash University, the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources, as we then were, and with funding from the ARC as well as from JUNA. And also we had a random help from a scientist from the University of Tsukuba in Japan. So first of all, we looked at the international context. This work done by my Flinders colleague, Tarek. So just looking at where in the world we had this situation where we had large amounts of naturally saline groundwater. And you can see they're actually quite extensive across the world where these things could potentially occur. But when we also looked at where we could find published literature on it in the scientific journals, we think there's probably a lot more in technical reports and so on, which are harder to access. We found that the vast majority of the studies to date have in fact occurred in Australia. So we're apparently at the... Oh, good God. La la la, nothing to see here. Beautiful trees. Oh God, not again. Yes, from Australia. Ian Cartwright at Monash did some hydrogeochemical studies in the South Australian Riverland, the Pike and Cataractco floodplains, if you're familiar with those. What he found was that we got younger groundwater in the clay, older groundwater at the bottom of the sand layer. Okay, that seems reasonable. That suggests that the water is coming some way. That narrows it down from between the... it's either coming vertically or horizontally. That doesn't help. But one thing he did find was that the youngest groundwater was in this layer just below the clay. And that strongly suggests that what we have is a situation where we've got preferential flow comes through during floods and then spreads laterally. So it's coming through these cracks in the clay or sandy units and then spreading laterally. This was a particularly strong pattern at the Pike floodplain. It also means that the diffuse rainfall through is probably kind of limited. And we had one variation at Cataractco floodplain where we could also see that the water was typically a bit younger near the river than it was away from it. So it suggests that at Cataractco and not at Pike, at least for the sites we were looking at, that we've got flow through the riverbed as well, adding to those lenses. I should say, I talk about them as freshwater lenses. They're not. None of us would actually want to drink any water. They're fresh from the point of view of that tree. So, 20,000 milligrams per litre you wouldn't want to touch. Now, this is different from an earlier study that Ian Cartwright did, which was in what I'll characterize eastern Sunraysia, so east of Nangalok Calignan, if you're familiar with that part of the world. And what he found with the geochemistry for that site was that you simply got younger water near the river and older water further away from the river. There wasn't much vertical stratification. So for those ones, flow through the riverbed is the essential driver. And in fact, there's a very large stretch of the river between Nangalok, Calignan, and Naya, where we've got losing stream conditions for the river and a wide, stable lens. So that means that from that point on, we've got a large, stable lens, but anything to the west, in New South Wales, Victoria, and all of South Australia, the lenses are probably being recharged through mechanisms that make them more infrequently freshened up and potentially more vulnerable. So another colleague, Adrian Werner, he used maths. So he used some equations that have been commonly used for 140 years, I think, for coastal seawater intrusion. And he sort of turned them upside down and put them into the correct geometry for a river. And well, I won't go through the maths. I'll just cut to two of the things that he found. He found that theoretically, that even when you've got gaining river conditions, you can have a stable freshwater lens. And also, he came up with some solutions for the width of the lens under different, under some various simple steady state cases. So, for the a river that stays constant in that unlikely event, we have a good idea of how that lens might extend. However, we wanted to check the maths against physical reality. You never need to check what your assumptions are. So we did also some laboratory experiments. And this is where our visitor, Atsushi Kawachi, was very helpful. And so he spent 3 days in a small cupboard photographing lab experiments and was able to confirm that the mathematics did actually match up with what was observed in the lab. Meanwhile, Tarek Latou was developing numerical models of a generic floodplain. I won't go into the details, but essentially we've got a bit of floodplain, we've got potential of flood inundation, we've got evapotranspiration, we've got river levels changing, we've got everything going on, and we looked at management options, different parameters. He ran literally hundreds of simulations, so I'll only show you a few. This is one example with long-term weir-pool change. So if you raise the river, such as putting in a lock, then that changes the extent of your lens. Or if you say you decide to inject here to maybe freshen things up for trees at this point, then maybe that's good for them here, but it will start to shrink your lens because you've got additional pressure and flow towards it. And we also did extensive work for a Catarapco case study for risk management for some works that are going on under the South Australian Riverland Integrated Infrastructure Program. Yep. So, getting on, yes, second last slide. So we were concentrating on knowledge transfer for this project as an ARC linkage. We got a lot of formal scientific outcomes, peer-reviewed publications, presentations at conferences, including this one. We worked very closely with what is now the Department for Environment and Water. It was made easier by having 2 of us in the project from the get-go, myself and Graham Green, regular updates and meetings, worked closely on things such as the Catarapco risk assessment. And all the models and tools will be moved to the model warehouse that's run by DEW. And we also made sure that we had wider stakeholder engagement. So presentations to interstate agencies, we travelled around, and also to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the Commonwealth Environment Water Office. So we hope that we achieved our aims in terms of good science, integrated into management, and with wider communication of our results, which is ultimately the aim of ARC linkage projects. Thank you.